Welcome to the High Performance Edge, the podcast for contractors who lead with building science and want to turn that advantage into a stronger, more successful business. Whether you're in HVAC, insulation, solar, or home performance, we dig into strategy, sales, marketing, operations, hiring, and customer service approaches that power stable, more profitable companies. Hear from top contractors and industry experts as we explore what it takes to thrive as a very different kind of contractor. Here's your host, founder and CEO of Energy Circle, Peter Troast.
Hey folks, thanks for being here. As I travel around the country, the question always comes up: how has my home state of Maine had such success with heat pump adoption? People call it the Maine miracle. If there's an example of a place where heat pumps have crossed the tipping point, it's here. The state blew past its goal of 100,000 heat pumps 2 years early, and just this year crossed 200,000, a year ahead of forecast. All in a small, cold, rural state full of practical show-me people who aren't easily wowed by the new thing. My guest has had a front row seat for all of it. Scott Libby, the founder of Royal River Heat Pumps, is a 41-year HVAC veteran who spent the first 25 of those years telling Mainers heat pumps didn't work here. Now Royal River does heat pumps only, and the press calls him the Dean of Heat Pumps in Maine. He sits on Mitsubishi's National Advisory Committee, helped launch their Diamond Elite Technician program, and gets called to Washington to brief Congress on heat pumps and electrification. What I especially love about Scott's story is that he earned all that not by being the biggest, but by being the best, designing for the home instead of the rebate and commanding a premium in a crowded, price-driven market. Exactly the kind of high-performance differentiation this podcast was created to promote. You'll get a lot out of this conversation. Let's dive in. Scott Libby, welcome. Great to have you here, and I'm very excited about you being on for the reason that as I travel around the country, and people know that I live in Maine, everybody asks the question about this Maine heat pump miracle. And part of the reason I'm so excited about you is that no one has been closer to the driver's seat of what has happened over the course of the last 15 years or so than you have, and so I think you've got a real great story to tell all of us. So we'll get to that. First off, though, and I'd like you to tell us about yourself and about Royal River Heat Pumps. I want to just say to everyone that Scott was a guest on the Amply Heat Pump podcast. I listened to it for the third time this morning. It's really excellent and is a really terrific story about Scott. The company, the history, the culture, everything. And so I'd encourage folks to definitely listen to that in concert with this, and will hopefully be complementary to what was there. So long preamble, but with that, welcome. Introduce us to Scott and to Royal River.
Peter, thanks a lot. It's actually great to be here. You and I have known each other for years, and however, we've not worked together. So it's really great to really start working with you, and it's an honor to be on your podcast. Yes, like Peter said, I am Scott Libby. I'm the owner and founder of Royal River Heat Pumps. I started in HVAC in '85, so this is year number 41 for me. And I spent the first 25 years saying that heat pumps don't belong in Maine. And now I have right around 40 employees doing nothing but heat pumps in Maine. I love doing heat pumps. I love this industry. I love the direction it's headed, with a lot of building science included in it.
I guess I'd like to just know a little bit more about that moment in time when you were working in traditional HVAC, and because in 2013 this was, I think the numbers are that there were something like 8,000 heat pumps installed in the state of Maine at that time. So how did you? For a guy who was out telling people that these things don't work, what happened, and then how did you make that decision to open up your own shop?
Yeah, I was working for another company in my last job. I was intrigued by mini splits, but they still weren't where they really needed to be for anything other than air conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
But then watching and really just trying to learn as much as I can about the industry, and just kind of gobbling up information about products and, manufacturers and what they're doing. I started paying attention to cold climate heat pumps. And I ended up working back on the contracting side, but I was hired as a service manager and then took over in sales and really realized that these heat pumps are actually low ambient heat pumps. I think at the time they were, 100% of their capacity down to like 13 degrees.
Hmm.
And now they're, 100% capacity down to minus 13. So
Yeah.
they've really become a viable option. And, I started selling them when I was with another company, and I realized that every customer that we did it for would call up and say that they love it. And,
Yeah.
they weren't saying that about the 275-gallon oil tank that we were putting in their basement.
Right.
And I didn't have to carry a 275-pound oil tank into the basement. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
I just got to a point in my career where it was like, I'm just going to do my own thing. I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to run it the way I want. And, I'm going to learn everything about it. And it's really been fun. It's been 13 years since I started Royal River. I am 59 and a half now. I love doing what I do, and I love watching the advancements, of the technology.
Yeah.
I'm on Mitsubishi's National Contractor Advisory Committee. I just had the privilege of going to a new facility that they have that's an research lab where there are 80 PhD scientists working on things that we will see 10 years from now. And
Amazing.
really just having a real inside look at what's coming, and it's exciting.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you went there. That was you beat me to my question, which is that you have achieved this kind of elite status within the Mitsubishi community, but also in Maine. People in Maine call you the dean of heat pumps in Maine, and I'm just curious about how you're dining earlier this week with with the president of all of Mitsubishi for all of North America. How did all of that come to pass?
I don't know how a lot of it has come to pass, Peter. I was in Washington, D.C. twice last year, speaking to senators about electrification and heat pumps and tax incentives. I've found myself just kind of being pulled into it. And, I think how I've really positioned myself, to do what I'm doing is really just learning everything about the product, not just reading the installation manual, but the engineering manual and, taking things that aren't necessarily paired combinations and putting them in my house and really breaking things. We have a great training facility here. So I'm looking across the room at a unit that had a problem that nobody knows what it is. So we pulled the entire system out and, we hooked it up here exactly the same way it is. We have computers hooked up to it. We're watching everything. We're watching the linear expansion valves. We're watching, the hertz. We're watching the compressor ramp up, and we're actually sharing that information that we're gathering here back with Mitsubishi. And I do it in a way that's not confrontational. It's not condemning. It's, like I was kind of the brainchild of the Diamond Elite Technician program that it took 2.5 years to get it off the ground, but now there are 65 of them across the country and more knocking on the door to get in. So I've always just wanted to like be a real partner.
I do want to come back to at the end to talk more about how your passion for the technology has really had a huge impact on the Royal River brand and your recognition in the market. So let's park that for just a second. Let's talk a little bit about Maine. You and I both travel, and everybody, talks about the Maine miracle and heat pumps. And at the same time, there's some skepticism, right? A lot of people sort of dismiss the Maine miracle based on, well, those kinds of conditions don't exist anywhere else in the country. So you've been right there, front row seat from the very, very beginning of this wave. And just so everybody knows, like Maine set a goal of 100,000 heat pumps by 2023, blew that goal away, set another goal of 175,000 by 2027. And they've now already this year have crossed 200,000. So help us, paint the picture of, like how this went. How has it evolved over the years?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It has really evolved. We were installing, I started out me and my truck. My goal, I showed up at home one day and told my wife, I gave my 2 weeks notice, and she said, "What are you going to do now?" And I said, "Start a heat pump business." So, I really had no choice. This Sunday is our 29th anniversary, and I'm glad the last 13 years didn't impact that. So, my goal was to install a heat pump every day. And, if it qualified for a rebate, great. If it didn't, that was great too.
Mhm.
I've always been one to design an HVAC system for the home
Mm,
and or the occupants. I've never been one to design for the rebate. We initially had a rebate system that you got, 500, 750, $1,000, whatever they were giving away at that time. It's always been changing over the years, but you would get that for a single zone, regardless of if you were shutting off the oil or shutting off the gas. You would even do a multi-zone and get a base price and then an additional, for each additional indoor unit.
mhm.
That's all gone away now. But I think what I really was a part of in not me making the efficiency main program what it is, and becoming the miracle program that every state in the country is looking to model. Efficiency Maine did a fantastic job marketing,
Yeah.
um, laying out some data that showed contractors and homeowners that they actually do work in Maine. But I think the most important thing was that they got the contractor buy-in.
Mm,
I think there are currently 650 registered vendors in the state of Maine that are
yeah.
qualified to submit a rebate for you on the homeowner's behalf. That's a lot of contractors.
That is an incredible for a little state like ours. That is a
Yeah.
lot of
You know,
contractors.
sometimes I think it's too many.
Yeah, it's definitely.
Certainly the top 50 do the 80% of the work.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
but
So,
it's that
I,
contractor buy-in.
yeah. So in the beginning, and you correct me if these aren't right. I believe the stat is of that first 100,000 units, 80,000 of them were a single ductless head that went into a home over top of an oil system. Without necessarily taking that oil, without taking the oil system out, homeowner got air conditioning that they never had, and then took some bite out of their out of their heating load with the heat pump versus the oil. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know what the percentages are, but yeah, it's certainly ductless. In the beginning, we didn't really have a ducted air handler that would do much more than a couple hundred square feet. You certainly
Yeah,
couldn't do a whole house with it.
yeah.
Um, and I think the majority of those 600 vendors, that's probably all they do is
Mhm.
ductless single zones. But now you know, we have ducted units here, both low static and the high pressure ones that we can do, an entire first floor of a home with. We have floor units, we have ceiling units. There are so many different combinations that you can really tailor a system to the house.
Yeah. Well, let's get to that because I know like part the incentive program has changed and is now uh, is favors whole house systems and so forth. But back in those days when the demand was growing for people recognize this, I can get an air conditioner that I never had, and it also heats, right, and might lower my oil bill. Can you what do like as you were at the sort of ringside seat of this sort of awareness and adoption of this product in the marketplace, what do you look back on and say, happened? Because we've gotten to a place in Maine where there's very little skepticism about the technology, right? Like I don't hear it very often.
Yeah, I mean, it started off that every customer I went to, um, they were interested in heating. They had a room that wasn't comfortable, the bonus room over the garage, or some four-season room that they added onto the back of the house that didn't have proper heat in it. Oftentimes looking to replace like a monitor heater or Rinnai heater or something like that. And then we really started like doing them in living rooms and dining rooms and kitchens and really just attack that one thermostat on the first floor, which, it's not a scientific number that I'm throwing out, but that can account for like 70% of your oil usage. We're primarily oil in Maine, a lot of propane, the more populated areas along the Maine Turnpike have some natural gas, but mostly oil.
Yeah. And I saw a stat earlier this week, the conference here in Portland where the governor's office and Michael Stoddard from Efficiency Maine reported that previously 70 to 80% of homes in Maine were heated with oil, and it's now 50, thanks to the Maine miracle. So, but was there a time, in that run up to 100,000 that you were part of where suddenly people just, didn't have any more questions about the technology? They kind of knew that it worked. And, there was the classic sort of crossing of the tipping point.
Yeah. I mean, I look at it as like a momentum,
Yeah.
We started at the top of the hill with a little snowball, and we were, it was so small, it didn't have any mass, and we were really just kind of pushing it. And then once it started rolling, and the word of mouth was amazing. I want a heat pump because my neighbor has one, and I walked into their house and it's lovely. And they showed me what they've saved on fossil fuels. And, and then the last 3 summers have been the hottest summers on record. And this year is looking like it's going to be make that the 4 hottest summers. So initially everybody wanted it for heating, and more and more now, we're getting more people who want it for air conditioning.
Well, that's really interesting, because I would have thought it was kind of the opposite, right? That this was a air conditioner that people never had and never frankly needed until temperatures started to change, and that it had a heating benefit. And so that's interesting. It's a little different than what I was expecting.
Yeah, we have these big surges like in the fall, after the kids go to school, I think is when people realize like, okay, the kids are gone. What now? Oh, that's right. Heat pump.
Yeah.
But then certainly there's always been an 80-degree day in May. And that's the trigger point for kicking off our summer business. And what do we have? An 85-degree day in May, and then 2 90-degree days back to back. The phone's been ringing like crazy. So
yeah. Okay. Well,
I think it's the momentum is how I refer to it, Peter. Everybody, they tell me that they see my vans everywhere. And at that point, I only had like 3. Seeing the vans, and they're like they want a heat pump.
Yeah. Well, it's you can't drive around Maine and not see them everywhere, right? And they're on every shape and size of house, right? That's, I think, the thing. And so, just seeing that alone, I think is, confirmation to everybody that like, wow, everybody's got these things, right? So, but one of the things, you've always stood for, really high quality design and whole house solutions. And, you've had the full suite of all the Mitsubishi products, whether they're ducted or ductless, et cetera. And so, but that has been a recent shift, I guess, right? In the last few years of more whole house jobs. Is that accurate?
I've always designed HVAC systems for the home. But yeah, Efficiency Maine switched it to a whole home rebate. So the only way to get a rebate now is if you do a system that is classified as whole home, meaning that you can turn your oil thermostats off or all the way down and only use them with a generator. Unless you're using your boiler for hot water, you can still, keep the boiler turned on in the basement, but only use it for domestic hot water.
Yeah. And has that change in the incentive been a meaningful thing in terms of I suspect it's not really for you because you have been so, whole house, oriented right from the start.
Yeah, I mean, before the whole house rebate program started, I was always in the top, one, two, or three in the state.
Hmm.
And that's based upon the number of rebates submitted. Since the whole house program started, we've dropped to like I think we bounced between like number 8 and number 10. It's not because we're doing less heat pumps, it's because we're processing less rebates. My mindset is always go to the home, design the system for the home and or the occupants. I mean, if you have a couple that's empty nesting and they have 3 bedrooms upstairs that
Hmm.
are not being used, why put a heat pump in them?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so we design for the home, and if it meets the rebate criteria, it's a bonus. You know what? I refuse to design a system just for the rebate.
Gotcha.
When
Yeah.
somebody's desires are to have air conditioning in their living room and their primary bedroom, that might cost them 15 or 16 or $17,000, but it doesn't meet the rebate criteria. So, to get a rebate, now I need to add a tri-zone on top of that. So they're going to spend $30,000,
Yeah. Yeah.
$35,000 to get a $3,000 rebate. That math doesn't work for me. So,
Got it. Okay. Okay. And I would say, this is a good segue to like where I wanted the conversation to go in terms of your premium, your recognition in the marketplace as kind of the best, and, and the fact that you've attracted kind of more premium clients that presumably are, not as incentivized by a $3,000 rebate. So is that, do I have that accurately? And is, was that a specific strategy to go for the top of the market?
yeah, I think I focused more on, the middle of the market, the value, I mean, it's great to do heat pumps in, a $5 million home. And we do those, but, we're more, the $7 to $1 million homes. We do
Hmm.
a lot of $300,000 homes. All as I care about is that we do the right thing. I went to a customer's place today, and the woman was a little standoffish at first. She actually said, "Well, I don't want a piece of that plastic stuff on the front of the house, so I don't know how you're going to do Jake's room." And me and her husband had spoken about it already, and I said, "Well, we're going to do a ceiling unit in that room so that my piping can go through the attic and down the back side of the house and not, right near your front door."
Yeah.
And she had 3 other quotes already, and they were all going to run the piping on the front of the house. So, we've always just been a little more just, more custom, more creative, I guess.
Yeah. Well, do you think that, like, that's a good example, but she didn't really know that there was such thing as as a cassette that could go in the ceiling. Do you sense that with all that's happened in Maine that there is a more sophisticated, customer base now that gets, more system oriented design and, is starting to recognize, load calculation necessities and that kind of stuff?
I mean, it's amazing how the world has changed in 13 years. I mean, you can just now you go on to AI and say, "I want a heat pump, but I don't want one of those white things hanging on the wall. Is there a different option?"
Mm,
And AI will tell you every option there is. What should I ask a contractor that's coming to my house? And AI is going to tell them everything to ask. They're going to talk about manual J, manual D, manual S. It's really a different world than when I started it. So I think people have a greater ability to educate themselves now. But a lot of people are still very surprised when I tell them that we have a ceiling unit, we have a floor unit, we have a
yeah.
ducted unit, because
Yeah.
all the other quotes coming in, they just want to do the wall unit and get in and out.
Yep. Yep. Cool. I mean, you and I have talked about this. I really think this idea of people using AI to find good contractors it's one of our best friends, because, you showed me an example of somebody who put one of your quotes, through ChatGPT and, ChatGPT said, yes, they are high priced and you should go with them. But I would say, just going back to what would you say to, contractors around the country, because there's a lot of them that are kind of taking an eye and looking at this heat pump thing, depending on where they are, and just, maybe it's a little bit of a wary eye about whether this is really going to be a sort of a viable market. What would you say to them?
I don't know. Be a believer, because, I always compare it to, can you imagine the guy that walked into the house with the cast iron radiator and told the homeowner that he was going to put one of these giant cast iron radiators underneath every window? I think the homeowners might have had the same objection as they do to these white things hanging on the wall. What do you mean you're going to burn oil? That's not going to work. It's not a fad. It's not a trend. Heat pumps have been outperforming unitary equipment, furnaces, boilers, everything for the past several years.
That's a great place to wrap it. Scott, thanks so much for being here. Really fun conversation. Appreciate the time. Appreciate you very much. And thanks again.
Ask me anytime. I think the world of you, and I love what you're doing, not only with Energy Circle, but also with the High Performance Edge podcast. I love the fact that we're bringing information about the industry to the industry.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, sir. The High Performance Edge podcast is brought to you by our company, Energy Circle, the marketing agency that for 15 years has served the most successful high-performance contractors in the country. Curious about whether we might be a good fit for your marketing and website needs? It begins with a no-obligation, no hard sales discussion of your business and goals, and an honest assessment of whether we can make an outsized impact on your company. Check out energycircle.com or email me directly at peter@energycircle.com.